Haven't had that before. Good morning, Master Class. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's May 23rd already, and we are going to be talking about Judges 2 today. This will be a little jerky at the start because the sermon went a little long today, fortunately, and it'll probably be even longer next week. So you don't want to miss next week's sermon, I don't think, even though it's Memorial Day. So has anybody capable of filling this word in? Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, the men are good looking, and what's the last phrase? Anybody remember? Did you ever listen to Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon? It's one of the best Sunday afternoon programs. Wow. Nobody out there in Zoom land knows the last line of that? Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, the men are good looking, and the children are above average. And I love that last line. All the children are above average. I used to listen to Lake Wobegon when I was driving on Sunday afternoons. And one of the episodes in there, he said something that gave me a framework for things that were happening in my life that I had never thought of before. He was talking about how the people in Lake Wobegon, this is a mythical town in Minnesota, where many of the people are of Scandinavian origin, how that they used code words to signify things. And I never thought about my language, and the language of my family was code words. And he would say, especially with the farmers up there, things like the man would walk in, the wife would look at him, and he'd say chicken. And now, an hour later, on the table would appear fried chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, beans, so forth. That was the code word for this whole evening. It was not just the dinner, it was, okay, what are we going to watch for TV after that, and so on. So I started thinking in my life, what are some of the code words that I use? And I recognize a lot of times I use one word, and if I'm with the right person, one word will signify a lot of things. And that's true in our families often. And in fact, you've heard the old joke about the guy that I'm sure that went into jail, and all these prisoners have been there forever, but he's a new guy. And so he starts to tell a joke after a while, and they just look at him, like it's kind of odd. And then somebody says 42, and everybody starts laughing. After about 5 minutes, somebody says 63, and everybody's laughing. He goes, what's going on? I said, well, we've been here so long, we all know the same jokes. We just have code words for them. And so they didn't have to tell them. So the Bible has a lot of code words in it that are cultural, that if we don't understand what is behind the code word, we can sometimes just gloss over things really, really quickly. We're going to come today to two code words, and at least, and probably some more, that are going to be very interesting, and we're going to get to them really quickly. So let's open our Bibles to Judges chapter 2. And you remember, I'm going to give you a quick summary of what we've been through in the Promised Land so far. The Israelites are in Egypt. God comes to rescue them by sending Moses. They come out through the Red Sea, where God wipes out the Egyptian Pharaoh and a bunch of the military. They go to Mount Sinai, where they make the covenant that God will fulfill the covenant that was made to Abraham. He starts fulfilling that, as well as a new covenant with the people. The new covenant with the people is as God saying, I will be your God, I'll be your protector, and the people saying, we will do everything you say. So they will be obedient. That is their job. Then for the next many days, God tells them what it means to be obedient. And they don't even get off first base before they're being disobedient. So that's the covenant that's going on. It's God saying, I will protect you but you have to obey me. Then we later get the 10 Commandments. The first 2 commandments have to do with, you will be my people if you worship only me. There are other gods, but you're to worship only me. That doesn't go very well. They end up not being willing to go in after the 12 spies go into the promised land. So they are required to be in the wilderness for a total of 40 years. At the end of 40 years, they travel up the east side of the Jordan River and end up on the plains of Moab. So Moab is the country, one of the countries on the east side of the Jordan River. And there we find out that Israelite men are very much like men of all other ages. They very quickly give in to the charms of the Moabite women. And consequently, there's a plague on the Israelites. They can't even get through the Moabite women before they are not only committing adultery, but they are starting to worship other gods. So if I was to say the word Baal, that's a word that if you've read the Old Testament, you hear on. Where's the first mention of the word Baal, B-A-A-L, in terms of a god? Now, there were places named Baal, but where's the first mention of it in terms of worshiping another god? And if you go look, you're going to find out it's Numbers 25. I think it's verse 3, if I'm not mistaken. That is on the plains of Moab, where the Jewish men not only fornicate with the Moabite women, but they are worshiping their Baals, their gods. So what's a Baal? Baal is a type of a Canaanite god. Now, depends on where you are in Canaan. Just like here in the US, if you start some fad or some trend in Florida, by the time it gets to California, it's the same trend, but it's taken on whole new aspects. Right? And so that's what's going on, is that the Canaanites had Baals or gods, and they would take on different aspects. Now, if you're living in Canaan that time, what are the two of the main things that you care about? What are your most basic things that you care about? Try to put yourself in, you're in a desert land, you are trying to raise your nation, stay alive and survive. First one is water, right? You want rain because that way, if you have rain, you don't only have water to drink, but you can grow your crops, right? So being able to be fertile from your land is really, really big. What's the second thing you want? Children, right? So same thing, fertile. You want to be aligned with that. So Baals were associated very much with the fertility side of that. We're going to come across another word very quickly, and it's said different ways, but it's spelled Asheroth. What's an Asheroth? And where's the first mention of it? We're going to read it. The first mention of it is going to be in just a minute when we start reading in Judges 2. So an Asheroth was somewhat like the Baals. It was a god that took on different aspects depending on where you were. Probably originally came from Babylon, but by the time it's moved around to different regions and used different ways, you would have had different names for this. Typically, it took on the form of a female, but not always, sometimes a male. But if it's a female, it's obviously going to be also associated with fertility. But it would be very easy if you're associated with a fertility for that to become more of a religion that's going to involve prostitution, where the temple priests will be prostitutes. So you have going on in all of these, when you say the word Baals or Asheroth, it doesn't just mean something that you gloss over. This is code words for, this is a whole culture that we're talking about. When you say that Israelite worship the Baals and the Asheroth, you could stop there and think about that for 20 minutes. Because what it's telling you is they have given over the culture of worshiping God to the culture of worshiping the local gods. And all that entails is not just going to church on Sunday morning. It's your whole way of life is changing. Okay. So we will see these code words happening very quickly in Judges 2. And I confess I have glossed over that over and over and not given that enough thought. But we're going to concentrate on some of those as we get into this lesson today, because if you catch this right, what we're going to see is, and why I'm pounding on this, and I'm going to pound on it more, is for the rest of the Old Testament, this is going to be the challenge. It's the Baals and Asheroths and the worshiping of the gods that Israel never gets by. And all the way through the Old Testament, it's the very thing that sends them into exile that Mitch was talking about in his sermon today. So you have to keep in mind that it was on the plains of Moab, and right now in Judges 2, when we get to there, the game has changed. The people have basically said, God, we don't want you. We want you when we need you. But the rest of the time, we want the false gods. And what are they associating with that? Rain, provision for food, and sex. So you're going to see this for the whole rest of the Bible. And this is a good time to pick it up. Sometimes I will teach that God wasted the last 8 commandments of the 10, because it's the first 2 that the Israelites are challenged with from over and over and over. It's the worshiping of other gods. The other things are true, and you shouldn't do them, but you don't see them really being the problem for the rest of the Old Testament. Okay, so we have a turning point today.
Do you think that it was a gradual shift because of the influences, and that there was this period where they were sort of influenced but still worshiping God, kind of doing both, and then all of a sudden?
Okay, that's a very good question. So was this a shift where the Israelites went from worshiping God to worshiping the Baals, or was this a gradual thing? And the answer is yes. It's both gradual and sudden. And one of the reasons is because they could convince themselves it was okay to do both. So the periods of time you get where they're worshiping God only, the Baals only, or a combination of the two.
One of the challenges today in preaching Christ, teaching people Christ, is that they want to add that to the things they already have.
Right. So Lyle is just saying one of the challenges of making disciples today is people want to add our God and Christianity to the way that they live without changing the way they live. And what we will see through the Judges and all the way through the Old Testament is you don't get to do that. It's either God solely or it's not. If it's God in combination, that is just as bad as worshiping false gods by themselves. But we will definitely watch the Israelites try to do both. And we will see probably the best example of this is when we get to the book of Hosea here in many, many weeks, that you just see this in spades happening. But
It sounds like in verse 10 where it sounds like it's just one generation.
okay, so let's just jump into Judges and we'll talk about timing. So let's go into Judges 2:1. And we start with a little bit of a controversial verse just to start with. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. That means they're false gods. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I've also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. As hopefully you remember, originally God said he would drive them out. But after the plains of Moab, where they met with the Baals, after that, God's like, I'm not going to do any good for me to drive you out, drive these people out. You're going to have to kill them. You're going to have to do it yourself, because that's just the way, that's the nature. You have put me in that box. Angel of the Lord here, the question is that a person, or is that an angel, or is it Jesus? And the answer is it's one of the three, probably. And I don't know which one, but I think the way it's phrased here is it's not a prophet, but it is a true angel of the Lord. And it may be as a personification of Jesus. I won't, I say may, some people, even in this classroom, are very strong that it is Jesus.
Is Gilgal where the tent tabernacle was? Is that where they set it up?
At this point, I don't know. It ends up in Shiloh, but I don't think it's in Shiloh yet. I think it's in Gilgal.
Yeah.
I think so. So the Israelites are basically sentenced now to God that they're going to have to go in and since they didn't follow the rules of killing all the people and not making treaties with them, this is going to be a snare. And Moses predicted that. If we talked about that when we were in Deuteronomy, that Moses said, this is what's going to happen if you don't drive them out. So now the angel of the Lord is saying, okay, you didn't drive them out. Moses was telling you, and that's what happened. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord. So they didn't change their ways, they just offered sacrifices to the Lord. After Joshua dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. And that's what we talked about in Judges 1, where each tribe went to their own area, and they were supposed to drive out the inhabitants and not make treaties, but they didn't do that. So that's what we talked about last week. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. So we had this generation, Joshua's getting ready to die, but there's also elders that are alive during his time period. So after Joshua dies, and a fairly short time period after that, you would think maybe in terms of a decade or two, maybe, that's when that generation has died out. Now the next generation takes over. And the next generation, so Joshua dies in verses 8 and 9 and verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped the various gods of the people around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreth. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. So when the Israelites decide to worship the Baals and Ashtoreths, that all comes apart. God is no longer bound by his side of the covenant because the Israelites broke their side of the covenant. He said he would never break his covenant, and he didn't. The Israelites did. Now he's going to keep trying. He wants that covenant to be in place, and he's going to keep trying, but he's going to be unable to do that because the people will never be faithful to God. It's the people who do that. So it's a fairly short time. They are worshiping the other gods. Now they're in Canaan. They got possession of the land in total, but not all the pockets of these people are dead. And so now we're going to set up the whole cycle that is going to go through the rest of the book of Judges, and really we see it through the rest of the Bible that we'll talk about in a minute.
Deuteronomy 6.
Deuteronomy 6.
Where it says you shall teach your children diligently.
Okay.
Keep teaching generation to generation. They already good.
Yeah, so Lyle was talking about Deuteronomy 6, where they were instructed to teach their children. Obviously, they either didn't teach them at all or they were ineffective in how they taught. But it looks like they didn't spend much time at all teaching them a good lesson. Yeah. And remember, I have always been guilty of this, and I admit it freely. When my kids grew up, I was going through a fairly hard time in life. I thought, I'll just give them the Bible. I'll try to let them read the Bible, make sure they get to church, try to have the youth minister help raise them because I'm not doing a very good job. I was putting off my responsibilities. They didn't even have Bibles to give their kids. The only way they're going to get transmitted, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, they have got to teach, they have got to tell. It's this constant teaching that they apparently didn't either do at all or didn't do well. Remember, they did not have written Bibles to give their kids.
And you can pretty much see this. This is what's happening in our society right now. The society, I can't remember the forefathers, what they wanted this country to be.
Jerry was just saying what's going on in the country right now, but and I think both politically and from a religious standpoint, yeah, what's being taught in schools is way different than what was being taught in schools, at least when I grew up, for sure. And we will see the consequences of it just the way they did. Yeah. If you don't teach your children, like Crosby, Stills, and Nash, don't teach your children well, then it's not going to go very well for them. It's all about that. Any other thoughts before we keep moving on? Anybody out in Zoom land? All right. Then we will, since we started late, we don't have time to go through every verse, but we'll pick up in verse 15. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. So the Lord is going against the Israelites. They're his people, but he's going against them because he's trying to teach them a lesson. And the lesson is you got to repent and come back to me. That's the lesson. Verse 16 starts with the summary of the rest of the book of Judges. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders, yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the way of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Okay, so that's a summary of what's going to be part of the book of Judges. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. So that's the thing you'll have to remember, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to their ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Again, a waste of the other 8 commandments. It's the other gods that are the case here. And corruption is defined by that worship, not by the things that we would in our modern day define as being corrupt. Verse 20, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. Okay, we talked last week, remember, when Joshua was alive, they conquered the main cities down the center of Israel and some other parts, but they left little pockets that Joshua did not drive out everybody. And when the separate tribes went out to take their properties, they all left little pockets of local people. They chose not to follow the Lord. And the result of that is, because they didn't follow the Lord, all their idolatry is passed on. And he said it. I will, verse 22, why did he do this? I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord has allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So they were there for 2 reasons. One, we'll read in the future. They were there to help the Israelites become better at warfare, but also a test to see whether they would wipe them out and not worship their people. And they fail miserably, and they start right after the death of Joshua and the people that were alive with him. So some of the code words that we will see, again, you'll see over and over Baals, Asherahs. You'll also see the word high places, because they would often worship, like pagans around the world for some reason tend to pick high places to worship false gods. You'll see altars. All of those words are not only code words for just saying on Sunday morning we go worship these people, but our whole way of life is going to be based on that. The way we think, who's providing for us, our culture, everything around that. And that's what we're going to be seeing over and over for the remaining part of the Old Testament. One of the trends you see here, and Zach and I talked about it before, is it's generally not a case that they do well, then they do bad, then they do well, then they do bad, and over time it's even. It's over time, it's a general decline. They recover, but it's never as good as it was. And it's a downhill stroke. And we're going to watch that till we get toward the end of the Kings and Prophets. The finality of this is going to be Manasseh, who is such a bad king that no matter what they do, they can't repent enough. But there is a point where you can't come back. And that's where I think of all the sad things in the Bible, that's one of the saddest passages, is when he tells them, yeah, you repented, but it's too late. You guys were so bad for so long, I can't do it again. So through Judges, what we will see, and summarize the book, we're going to see just what this chapter said. He raises a judge, the people repent, follow the judge a little bit, things get better, then they go back to their false god, things get worse, he raises another judge. We could just stop now. The rest of the book is just details for that cycle, and it's going to come back. And they finish it at the very end with, we don't want any more judges. This isn't working. Give us a king. So that's where we will start. The next series will be when we pick up with that. Okay.
Hebrews 10:26.
Lyle's going to read what?
Hebrews 10:26.
Hebrews 10:26.
For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice of sins.
So if you read Hebrews 10:26, it talks about this idea of you can't keep on sinning, that it does end up at a place where there is no longer a sacrifice for you. Now, fortunately, that day so far has been put off. God said, 2 Peter, that he's patient, not wanting anybody to perish, but everybody to come to repentance. But one day, we're going to find out just like they did in Judges. And we'll find out just like they did with Manasseh. So the rest of the story is, you're going to hear a lot of repetition with just details in between. And I'm going to wrap it up there. Everybody, thanks for coming. And I urge you to, if you can't be here in person next week for Mitch's sermon, get online and listen to it. His sermon next week may be one of the most powerful ones he's ever preached. I've gotten to have the privilege of hearing a little bit of it already. So it will be a big deal. So trying to do it. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Hey, does your